Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Week 5 lecture, where we're starting to enter into a phase where we're talking about the institutions of the European Union. We've set this up really well. We've had a nice conversation already this semester about various theories of European integration. We've talked about the history of the emergence of the European Union and its trajectory, its various dilemmas and problems in its story as it's grown, both widening and deepening. Widening by introducing new members, deepening by expanding its competencies, and becoming more of a supranational actor. Um, Most recently, we've also talked about the um, sort of legal sources of the European Union's standing, institutionally speaking. That was an interesting conversation as well because it sort of gave some flesh to the bones of the theoretical conversation, the theoretical controversies that we had been trying to discuss 2 weeks ago in our theory section. Um, I think, in a sense, having talked about the sources of the European Union, legally speaking, we're in a very good position this week to start talking about the institutions. Because the institutions are the sort of physical manifestation of this both theoretical and legal phenomena that is the emergence of the European Union as a multi-perspectival entity, a multi-perspectival force. Is it an intergovernmental body? Is it a supranational body? Is it some kind of strange hybrid combination of the two? Is it, um, you know, an entity that has multiple and overlapping polities, which would evoke something more akin to a medieval kind of political regime, in contrast to the more sort of Westphalian model that we're so used to talking about in our everyday speech these days, because we're, of course, creatures of the era of Westphalia. And if you don't know what I mean by Westphalia, maybe you haven't taken an international relations course, but Westphalia was the Treaty of 1648 that ended the 100 Years' War and created the modern order of nation states in Europe. I'm not going to get too deep into that. Don't worry about it. But the point is simply to, again, sort of emphasize this sort of distinction that, as we were saying so long ago, now a couple of weeks ago with John Ruggie, perhaps the language of medievalism is useful to us here in trying to describe this puzzling entity of the European Union that is neither intergovernmental nor supranational, but somehow perhaps a combination of the two in a hybrid sense. So let's get started then this week with our discussion of the EU institutions. The EU, we've been setting this up. The argument has been that the hypothesis, rather at least, you're welcome to disagree if you want, is that the EU is definitely the most successful, the most completed, and the sort of most advanced international organization that has ever existed in the history of humanity. It's far more developed and robust than the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the Red Cross, NAFTA, IMF, World Bank, you name it, right? Nothing has ever quite come close to this before. And the physical entities that sort of attest to that power are the institutions of the European Union. And our core lecture theme this week, but also next week, the sort of overlying or overarching theme, is that the EU has indeed achieved a high degree of supranationalism, an unprecedented degree of supranationalism. And in this sense, then, it has largely bypassed or circumvented the national interests that would make this a kind of an arena wherein we might expect to see a positive sum or a zero sum game playing out constantly. We have to take seriously the fact that the member states decided when they created the European Union, when they signed into the treaty. Different member states did it at different times, of course. As we already know, there were different phases of expansion, and that expansion may still be continuing. Um, Obviously, different reasons for different states, but one argument that we can sort of see, functionally speaking, binding them all is that they joined the European Union to give credibility to their commitments. They gave their power to this supranational entity in order to give their rhetoric force, and to be sure that the commitments that they were making to each other would not be compromised by a recalcitrant or free riding partner. That is to say, a partner who might try to ride the bus, so to speak, without paying his or her fare. So there's a certain virtue then to locking in your commitments with these entities, with the power of these entities, giving them a power to police you, so to speak, to agree to be policed, to subject yourself to a police force, so to speak. At least that's the theory. Okay, it might sound idealistic to you. I don't know if it does, but after all, the United States did it once, a very long time ago. I mean, arguably, there's a precedent for this. Now, obviously, that took a very serious war, and the United States was formed as one country from the beginning, and there's a sense in which there was a common polity there already. That definitely made the United States' version of this story a lot easier. The European Union has also, in its history, had many wars, but those wars were not wars of independence from a foreign aggressor or foreign, imperial power. They were wars against each other. They were inter-imperial wars, if you will, and so the European Union's kind of original context is very different to the context that the United States experienced. Although those parallels are obviously useful and interesting to talk about at the same time. So today, to go back to my hypothesis here with you today, the European Union has some state-like attributes, but again, it is this hybrid entity. It has certainly retained autonomous member states as key players in its proceedings, and that's especially so in the realm of what we can call high politics. Interestingly enough, there's a term I'd like to introduce you to here, which surprisingly I haven't mentioned, I think, until now, and that is the principle of subsidiarity. So we've talked in the past about how in the realm of high politics, that is to say, the realm of security, military affairs, that the nation states and people like Andrew Moravcsik have been very keen to sort of focus on this, that the European Union is still very much an international or intergovernmental body when it comes to that domain. But I would also point you to the fact that the European Union itself has sort of supported and agreed in principle that the nation states have a key role to play in government, even in very ordinary pillar one areas of interaction. The Treaty of Amsterdam in 1997 formalized this idea, and it's interesting because it's kind of a companion or mirror concept to the idea of nation states having jurisdiction in high politics, because here the European Union is leaving specific competencies and decision-making powers to the national level, not just when it comes to military affairs, but also in any domain where um, collective action is not required in order to make policy overall more efficient or effective. So the European Union certainly will be a very real presence in the legal relationships of the citizens to politics, to their politics, when it comes to questions of the single market and how the single market should function, for example. But if there is something that particularly just happens to pertain only to Irish people and it's something local to Irish people, the European Union won't intrude in that because it doesn't affect any of the business of the European Union. European Union involvement is not required to make the outcome more efficient or effective vis-a-vis the affairs of the European Union. And so that explains the principle of subsidiarity, that the European Union is keen not to be seen to be an interventionist, power-grabbing entity. Of course, that's probably all motivated by the widespread belief in the 60s, 70s, 80s, especially by the 80s. There was this growing sense and feeling that the European Union was governed by anonymous bureaucrats who were determined to take power for themselves in all areas of European life. And a complementary principle of the European Union in relationship to that point is that of proportionality, that you shouldn't engage in action. The European Union shouldn't engage in action beyond that which is necessary to address the issues that confront it. Now, I should say that that is the ideal. Everything I've been talking about so far is idealistic, and you watching me in this lecture are within your rights to disagree. Don't take everything I'm saying for granted. I'm giving you a particular point of view, and it may be wrong. For example, in the context of the ongoing financial crisis, the Troika, the so-called Troika, this is a three-partite, tripartite body constituted by the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, have sort of formed an advisory body, an enforcement body, in fact, that has been particularly brutal to peripheral countries. And it's not clear at all for many critics whether the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality have been followed there at all. Ask anyone from Greece, ask anyone from Ireland, and they would have perhaps serious reservations about suggesting that about the suggestion that the European Union keeps its nose out when it's not necessary for it to be involved. The European Union has been very, the Troika specifically has been very pushy to peripheral countries, and many would argue that that's a bad sign, of the European Union's commitment to the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality. Just some basic facts about the Commission then, which is our first institution that we're looking at today. And we're going to be looking at two today, actually. We're going to be looking at the European Council as well. We'll get to that in a few slides' time. But the Commission is where we start because it's the main bureaucracy. It's the main executive entity of the European Union. For some people, they would suggest it's the rule maker. You, as students of American government, would be aware that the president of the United States is the executive of the United States. That is to say, the person who takes legislation and makes sure it's implemented throughout the bureaucracy. So too, the European Commission is the primary executive power. Under the first pillar of the Maastricht Treaty, established in 1995, the Commission has some powers also to call for legislation. Which is a very interesting and important point. This is what we mean when we say the Commission is an agenda setter. Think of what the president does the United States president does in his State of the Union speech. He establishes a legislative agenda for the year ahead. He calls for legislation. He, of course, is not a legislator, but he certainly is someone who can use his public profile to call for legislation. And so too, the European Commission has a kind of a continuous legal personality that allows it to understand and keep its finger on the pulse of what's going on in the implementation side of legislation, that is to say, with the bureaucracy, and report back, and in so doing, set the agenda for what needs to happen next. So the European Commission has really developed over the decades, as in this sense. It has achieved and picked up a lot more powers than it used to have, and this has all taken place as the European Union has sort of ceased to be simply an intergovernmental body, and grown in terms of its supranational competencies. So importantly, then, the European Commission shares some of its executive power with the intergovernmental body of the European Union, which is what we'll be talking about in a few slides' time, the European Council. But in the competencies or areas where the European Commission has executive power, it doesn't have to wait anymore for the authority from the nation states. That was the idea, of course, that was embedded in the very first iteration of the European Union, which was the European Coal and Steel Community. To underline this for you, the European community gave the Commission its own power, and it's not accountable to the nation states. It doesn't have to answer for the nation states in terms of how it exercises that power. So clearly, in this sense, then, we're saying something quite profound when we say that the European Commission has a guardian role. It is considered the guardian of the treaties, and not just the treaties, I should add, but also the entire body of legal acts, court decisions. We've talked last week alone about the precedent and the importance of legal precedent in the court decisions in terms of establishing interpretation and jurisdiction of the institutions of the European Union. So all of this accumulated legislation and legal decision making matters to the European Union beyond the treaties themselves, and this body of decision making and legal legislative acts we call the acquis communautaire. It comes from the French term acquis, meaning that which has been acquired or obtained, and communautaire, meaning of the community. And because the European Commission has the power to serve as a guardian and an enforcer to make sure that these laws are protected, it can take nation states, it has the legal personality to take nation states to court if they're believed to be in violation of the communautaire or the acquis communautaire or the treaties. Similarly, the European Commission can go after corporations, corporate entities like Microsoft, for example, in 2004, when it was found to be, for those of you old enough to remember this, this was also a concern here in the United States at the time. Microsoft was found to be giving undue privilege to its own internet browser, which it was loading onto Windows 95 and Windows 98 and Windows NT and all these operating systems, often at the expense of third-party browsers which were trying to compete and enter that market space. So the European Union fined Microsoft quite significantly for its monopolistic exploitation of the fact that it was the not just a vendor of a software, but actually that it had software which constituted a platform for the entire PC industry at the time. and still does to this present day, one could argue. Although, of course, there are other companies like Apple, and there are obviously some open source solutions. The vast majority of computers are still run on Microsoft. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's just an example of the European community's power given to the Commission. The Commission has the power to do research, to do investigations in the sphere of monopoly and antitrust practices in the European Union. The European Commission also has a personality in an international relations sense as well. It can be a body that negotiates international agreements on behalf of all the member states with other countries, like, for example, the United States. The recently abandoned TTIP and North Atlantic trade agreements were joined not by Britain or Ireland or France, but by the European Union as a legal personality. And that's what the Union has agreed that it will do, that it will represent all these nation states as a sort of a negotiating front, a common negotiating front in relationship to other regions and other countries. And a final point just to make here about sort of introducing the basic outline of the Commission is that the Commissions are often defined by the personality and the agenda of their presidents. So historically then we have this tendency to call or to refer to the Commissions by the name of their presidents. The Delors Commission, the Barroso Commission, and of course today, because Claude Juncker, who is here in the photograph, is the president of the Commission, we call the Commission today the Juncker Commission. Now, an important point to underline with you is that the European Commission serves at the pleasure of the European Parliament. And I'm going to get into this point in just a minute, but just to give you some background on who and what the Commission is first in a practical sense. There are various branches of the Commission, and the heads of those branches are known as commissioners. These are positions that are politically appointed, as I'll explain in a moment. The bureaucrats who run the Commission, however, in the day-to-day sense, will often be there for years working away, not as politically appointed agents, but rather as career bureaucrats and civil servants. That's neither they're employed, in other words, by the Commission, and it's nothing to do with the nation states from which they come. They are direct employees of the European Commission. Now, the Commission has changed in its personality over the years, and from 1995 onwards, a really interesting point is that the Commission has gone from being a 2-year term to a 5-year term. That's something that's very important for us to think about, because what we have to keep in mind is these types of institutions are nothing without what we call institutional memory. And so if you're constantly washing out your commissioners, the permanent bureaucrats have a very hard time relating that institutional memory to the constantly incoming new commissioners for the various branches. A 5-year term gives the bureaucrats a much better shot at introducing the commissioner to the culture of the division, of the branch, and helping them to understand what the continuous agenda is moving forward. You're going to have a commissioner that's more capable of being an effective manager then over the 5-year term, as opposed to over a 2-year term. Now, that all said, um, the Parliament, which is a body that we're going to talk about next week, is a very special actor in relationship to the business of the Commission, because at the start of every Commission period, every 5 years, um, the Commission, as proposed by the Council, has to be presented in front of the Parliament for a vote, right? And the President as well. So let's break those two things down and deal with them separately. We'll talk about the appointment of the President first. Ever since the Maastricht Treaty in 1995, the governments of the member states are obliged to consult with the European Parliament before they nominate a president, and then once nominated, they present that president before the Parliament to ratify the nomination. So critically then, the President of the Commission is serving at the pleasure of the Parliament. If the Parliament ever refused to vote for a council nominee, the council would have to find a new nominee. So we see the Parliament has a tremendous power at the time of appointment. But I'll go even further than that, because the Parliament, which hasn't always been a very powerful entity, some people in the 50s, 60s regarded it as nothing more than a talking shop. But today's Parliament is very, very different. Since 1979, as we may have mentioned before, the Parliament is directly elected by the population. And now that Parliament, that directly elected Parliament, has the power, if it wants to fire or to suspend, what's known as censure, the Commission as a whole. So I'm going to get to that point in just a minute, but that's just to sort of give you an understanding that really the Commission serves at the pleasure of the Parliament. Now, we've talked about how the President is appointed. Now let's talk about how the Commissioners are appointed. Now the Council, the European Council, has a process for figuring out the slate of commissioners that it wants. And that process is called qualified majority voting, which is actually something that we've talked about before. I'll talk about it again in a few slides' time when we detail qualified majority voting for the Council. But basically, the Council has to agree on a 75% weighting, a 75% vote, where different nation states, because of the size of their population, have different weights to their vote. I'll get into some details about that in a little minute. But basically, qualified majority voting is the process through which the Commission slate is established, and then that is presented in front of the European Parliament, which has the power to pass the Commission as a whole. Now, the Parliament has never really exercised its power to sort of do the unthinkable thing, which is to reject the Council's proposed slate of commissioners. But it almost did once, and that was in 2004, when the European Parliament's Social Affairs Committee threatened to refuse to invest the Commission over the proposal of an Italian gentleman by the name of Rocco Buttiglione, who was on the slate to serve as Commissioner for Justice, Freedom and Security. Problematically for the parliamentary committee, the gentleman in question was an advocate of strict Roman Catholic views on homosexuality, and these views were deemed to be so controversial that the Parliament found him to be obnoxious to European values. And the Parliament raised such a furore that, in fact, the Italians decided to withdraw him in favor of someone else. Now, that's probably, historically speaking, the sort of greatest moment in the European Parliament's history of holding the other institutions to account, flexing its muscles, so to speak. But all of that is bound up with the question of appointing the Commission and appointing the President of the Commission. The Parliament, once the Commission is in place, does have another very special power, and that is the power to fire or to censure the Commission as a whole. This is a power that has been brought up or invoked 7 times in the history of the European Parliament since, again, it became directly elected in 1979, but it's never once passed. It takes a two-thirds majority vote in the Parliament to get it passed. So far, it's never happened, but it did almost happen once, and that was in the 1990s when the Jacques Santer Commission, there was a major report, and I'll talk with you guys a little bit about that in a second, but there was a major report published where the Jacques Santer Commission was found to be basically guilty of corruption, and specific commissioners within that commission were found to be even guilty of nepotism, which is appointing family members to key jobs within your commission. So in March 1999, rather than face a motion of censure from the Parliament, the entire commission decided to resign en masse. Now, their term was going to be up 6 months from then anyway, so you might say not such a big deal, but it was a very, very important indication of the power of the European Parliament. The Parliament's Committee of Independent Experts had really issued just like a very damning report, and it concluded that it is becoming difficult, and I'm quoting here directly, it is becoming difficult to find anyone in the Commission who has even the slightest sense of responsibility. Really, it was seen by many parliamentarians that they needed to sort of really step in and use that kind of nuclear option that the Parliament has. Again, Parliament doesn't have a lot of powers in a sort of a day-to-day sense historically, but it does have this one power which it never really uses, but that even the threat of using it is very, very controversial. Now, the building in the image here is known as the Berlaymont, and it's an interesting metaphor for the state of the European Commission. The European Commission lives in this building called the Berlaymont. In 1991, you should know that this building was evacuated because it was determined that it had been, there was a lot of asbestos used in its construction. And the building went under a 13-year period of renovation, very, very expensive. I mean, hugely expensive operation to get the asbestos out of this building. They had to put a big balloon over it, and had to be very, very careful that the particulates of this asbestos didn't drift in the air, because this building, the Berlaymont, is right in downtown Brussels, and you can't have people in the middle of the city breathing in asbestos particles, of course. And it's sort of thought sometimes that this period, 1991 onwards, is sort of like a sad reminder of the end of the sort of golden years of the European Commission under Jacques Delors, who was, of course, the commissioner who introduced the Single European Act in the late 1980s and sort of bootstrapped the European Union back into the fast lane, having been in the doldrums with Margaret Thatcher, and previously to that, of course, General de Gaulle. We've talked about these things a lot earlier this semester. But from the late 1980s onwards, we have, where am I here? From the 90s onwards, 1995 specifically, we have Jacques Santer, who I just mentioned. His commission had to resign under the spotlight of huge and damning corruption charges. And then we have a very lackluster performance by a man by the name of Romano Prodi, an Italian gentleman whose commission didn't really seem to be going anywhere. And then the Berlaymont building reopens in 2004, when we have the appointment that same year of Manuel Barroso, who's largely seen as a successful president of the European Commission. One of the highlights of his presidency was the reopening of negotiations with Turkey the country of Turkey for accession into the European Union, which is a hugely controversial topic, by the way, I should mention, because there's a lot of debates about whether Turkey should or should not be. And now things have changed in Turkey recently, as you may know from following the news in the last 2 years. We've had major political upheavals in Turkey, and the accession negotiations for Turkey, I think, are well and truly on the back burner at this stage. I don't expect them to be going forward now for a very long time. But there was a very vibrant debate in the first decade of the new millennium as to whether Turkey could be part of the European Union. It has a landmass that is on the European continent, partly in Asia, partly in Europe, right? Because it straddles the Bosphorus, which is that little bit of water that goes between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. So Turkey has a legitimate claim to be part of, continental Europe, but and it was also working quite well towards satisfying the so-called Copenhagen criteria, which are the accession criteria that any member state must accede to if it is to join. And it's sort of sad, I suppose, that events have taken over in Turkey and suppressed that. But certainly that was one of the big things that Barroso was trying to sort of push for. Now, interestingly enough, in the context of the financial crisis that's been going on since 2008, it's worth noting that when Barroso left in 2004, in 2014, he went then on to become an executive at Goldman Sachs, the major Wall Street bank. And many people sort of look at that with a raised eyebrow because, of course, he was one of the very, very tough negotiators that confronted the peripheral countries as they tried to go about negotiating their way with the European Union out of their financial difficulties. And you've been reading more about that in your supplemental readings for this course. So it might be worth just taking some time to talk about the nature of the commissioners, specifically their relationship that they have to their home countries. Obviously, they come from a European Union country, so why can we be so sure, or how can we be so confident that they're going to be loyal to their countries of loyal to the Commission and not to their countries of origin? What gives us any guarantee? And the truth is that there is no real guarantee there. The commissioners do take an oath of loyalty, wherein they pledge to pursue the interests of the European community as a whole and not the interests of their nation state. But it is no secret that the citizens of most of the European Union countries, but especially I think the peripheral countries like Ireland, would hope, especially these countries tend to have sometimes more personality-driven politics. And these countries would certainly expect that having a commissioner in a key sector, like Ireland would love to have and often has had a commissioner in the branch of the Commission responsible for agriculture. Ireland is a very agricultural economy, and so having a commissioner for agriculture is a big deal. It's not supposed to be. They're supposed to be neutral, but certainly it is imaginable that commissioners would have pressure from home. After all, most of them have served in their home countries in a political capacity, and many of them would be well known before they kind of migrate to become European commissioners. I should say with a hint of irony that for Irish politicians, the European Commission has often been seen as a place of exile. There's a number of stories of Irish prime ministers facing a potential revolt or upheaval from within the ranks of their own party. I'm sure you know that, where Americans vote for their executive in the shape of the president in a national election, in parliamentary systems, we vote for a party, and the party takes its residence in parliament, and then they vote from the elected parliamentarians who should be prime minister. So it's possible that without even having an election, you can end up having a new prime minister. And one way in Ireland to avoid having a fellow member of parliament stab you in the back to become prime minister is to exile them. And if you have something like a cushy commission position, which is very high profile and definitely a career move, right? You can say like, all right, mate, I'm appointing you to be the Irish nominee to be the European Commissioner for this, that, or the other thing. Now, we do have this sort of concern or issue that there's a lot of commissioners. There are probably more commissioners than there need to be. And in fact, today we have 28 of them. Now, that makes sense that you have one commissioner per nation state when you have a relatively small European community. But as the European community gets bigger and bigger, do you really want to have more commissioners, and those commissioners each being responsible for sort of ministerial cabinet portfolios of a sort? Do you really want that? Have to introduce a new one every time you grow the European Parliament? Well, the Lisbon Treaty in 2014, the original draft of it was contained language that was supposed to limit the amount of commissioners to 2/3 the number of member states. Why? Because obviously, with enlargement, many were arguing that there was a need to end the one commissioner per nation state tradition. Interestingly, it was the Irish who shot this down, which is the reason why I'm laughing, of course, is because I've just been telling you the story of how Irish prime ministers love to exile people who are trying to stab them in the back to the European Commission. But it was shot down by the Irish in a referendum, and largely that was because, of course, of this perception that, a small country like Ireland needs to maintain the influence to whatever extent it can that it has within the institutions of the European Union. It doesn't want to get its voice lost in the expanding cacophony of voices as the European Union enlarges. So it makes sense from the perspective of the Irish population that having that one commissioner per state is maintains a very valuable point of leverage on the institutions from the perspective of the population of a small country. Now, it may not be very efficient, but certainly it's something that the European populations on the periphery appreciate. One last slide then on this section this week about the Commission, and then I'll pause, and in part 2 we will come back and talk about the Council of Ministers. The question really is to sort of return to our theories of the European Union, and to ask the question, is the European Commission perhaps a schizophrenic or schizoid organization? We should remember or recall that in our early classes we talked about the history of the European Union, and we talked about some of the founding fathers of the European Union, people like Jean Monnet. He had a very kind of like technocratic or expertise-based approach to his understanding of what the Commission was for and what it could achieve. We remember discussing Hallstein and the more sort of politically engineering approach that he took. We remember also talking about the malaise years, those years leading up to the Single European Act, where there wasn't a lot of political momentum, but many people would say behind the scenes, the European Commission was quietly putting in place plans for building rapport, building a sense of continuity, of purpose within the European Union, giving the whole thing a sense of its cultural mission, especially by bringing in and consulting with, at the national level, non-governmental groups. These non-governmental groups, of course, everyone from non-profits to unions, to umbrella groups for industry, would normally appeal their political messages to the government of their respective countries, right? But the Commission, sort of realizing it was roadblocked in the De Gaulle and in the Thatcher years, engage in a kind of a cultural diplomacy. What's the word I'm looking for? Strategy, to involve constituent groups at the local level. Now today, we've had more technocratic, a return maybe more to that technocratic early Jean Monnet style approach, and that's understandable because the European Union, got past its impasse with Jacques Delors, and today we've had people like Barroso, we've had people like Juncker, who seem to be commissioners of certain skill, but it would be important to remember that the European Union has, for a significant period, for 8 years now, 9 years now, been caught in a terrible economic crisis. And it's not clear how the European Commission is going to survive the challenges that this crisis is producing. Many people would point to the Syrian refugee crisis, for example, and the European Union's lack of leadership in dealing with that. There's been some terrible scenes of human suffering, with refugees dying at sea, and the European Union seemingly being very passive in its approach to dealing with that. That's one major challenge. And then another major challenge, of course, is the crisis itself and how the European Commission has, perhaps failed to demonstrate leadership where it might have the potential to demonstrate leadership in relationship to the question of how peripheral European economies are being dealt with. Now, all of that said, then the question that's on the table is whether the European Commission is a special kind of actor now, right? And I think the answer to that is certainly clear. The Commission, the European Commission, is a sort of is figurative of the debate that we've been having. It in itself encapsulates and is a case study of this debate between the various theories that we've been looking at in the last weeks. And to back that up, we can look at some of the writings of people like Andrew Moravcsik, for example, who has argued that the European Commission is a unitary actor. One very important response to that has been that the Commission has been important not just as a bureaucracy in relating to the member states, but also that it is itself a kind of a multi-organization or a multi-perspectival organization that has multiple internal dimensions. The fact that each commissioner, his or herself, has a lot of power, for example, that the Commission has, as we've been discussing, historically, when it's seen fit, engaged in kind of cultural diplomacy with domestic constituent groups, all points to the fact that the Commission has a kind of um, um, an actorness that exists at different levels of the game, number one, but also internally has a lot of variation within within itself. Um, so those are very sort of interesting points to conclude on as we think about the European Commission and what its significance is from a theoretical point of view.